So is it the case that the philosophy of education tries to enumerate and then to explicate these parochial goals for education?
I think it does, and people have gone about this in different ways. If you look at Lawrence Kohlberg's Just Society model, where teenagers, adolescents would be given dilemmas, moral dilemmas, and given an opportunity with some adult guidance to come to thought about the resolution of those dilemmas. That would be one way of working upwards in this cone, I think.
Because the philosophy of education, and I have a particular interest in this because when I was a psycholinguistics graduate student at University College London, I kept going to the Senate Hall, and opposite the entrance is a place called Institute for the Philosophy of Education. That's where I learned that there was such a thing, and it interested me very much, and there were people like Richard Peters, you know, running it and writing their books. So I worked it out that there were some basic thoughts here. First of all, their goal was to observe the actual and the possible in education, and to see where doctrines of wisdom played upon that contrast between the actual and the possible.
Yes, and I think the contributions of people like R.S. Peters in England and, say, Jerome Bruner in America and others in the last half century have given us some pretty clear thoughts on purpose. And there's always this abiding sense of the moral and the just. And how you get there, there seems to be some disagreement.
But there do seem to be certain cultural universals, which is particularly what I wanted to talk to you about today. I'll give you an example from my own experience. I started teaching for a living in the sense of actually being paid for it when I suppose I was about 24 or something like that. And I became aware right at the beginning that I knew very little about the theory of teaching. And very simple things I had to coach myself in. To speak so I could be heard. To speak not too fast, to speak at the level that could be understood, and so on. Gradually I became aware that, among other things, every act of teaching is an attempt at creating some kind of sacrament of communication on both sides. So somehow both the teacher and the student could advance towards that shared goal. Now, when I was teaching at the University of Washington many years later, I was fond of saying to the students, tell me what the ideal professor would be. And they, of course, they would easily say, you know, good grades, etc., etc. I said, now how about the ideal student? They were silent. They had nothing to say. Nobody apparently had even considered the possibility that you could grow as a student. But this ascent that we're talking about towards transcendence is a gradient of the pursuit of excellence by all the parties, right?
Well, I think what you've just said is very noble and very insightful. I suppose if we were to think about a classroom, an imaginary classroom with teacher and students, and ask ourselves, from an academic standpoint, what would be an ideal moment in time in that classroom, from a moral standpoint?
That would also be good calculus. It's like freeze-framing the area under the curve, you know, the ideal moment.
Right.
Yes.
And asking ourselves, what's the purpose-driven sense of this place? What's going on in here of any real account? How, if we were to take the measure of the moral excellence,
it would be wonderful if somebody would do that.
The social, the emotional excellence.
But this seems to be something that's more in the breach than in the observance, you know.
Absolutely.
However, the fact that we can think of it points to the possibility that it could actually occur. And there is an interesting approach to the philosophy of education from calculus, which is to say, educational excellence is the sum of all the ideal moments in a classroom. And if we're to ask all the constituents, what are those ideal moments, they would enumerate them very easily. All the participants are involved, and to the highest degree of attention, and not just present. It's not just a matter of showing up and saying, present, and then going back to something else. The teacher is well prepared. The teacher knows the students, you know. The ecology of the environment is ideal. The subject and the method are homologous. Now, I used to say to the students in the business school at University of Washington, why don't we call our subject a laziness instead of a busyness? Because busyness is a homologue, you know, of busyness, you know. So Should we be business-like in teaching business? And initially they were nonplussed, you know, but they soon came around to see that it made sense. And should a medical school be a place of healing? To say no to that is to embrace a contradiction and to produce dissonance. And we know from Leon Festinger and other things, you know, that cognitive dissonance leads to pain. Yes. Pain leads to suffering, and the people desire justice, and then the whole thing collapses to a lower level of excellence and remains there. Is it possible that there's an academic ideology even that governs some of these ideals, or limits them perhaps?
Oh, it's not possible. It's actual. Schools are bureaucratic places. Some of their strengths are found in that, and some of the weaknesses. But I think what you were suggesting is that what we can imagine, we can and will create.
That certainly makes sense, doesn't it? And the writers of imaginative literature, well, this is brought out by people like Abraham Maslow in England, Abraham Maslow in America, Colin Wilson in England, in books like The Strength to Dream, Literature and the Imagination. More and more it's realized that the schism or the separation between fact and fiction is quite artificial, that facts, so-called, are ideological moments themselves, you know, and that both of them are sublated to the high level of the myth, you know, the myth of American excellence or Chinese excellence or whatever it may be. That's not to say that we can escape these myths. What we want to do is to know them.
Yes, and if we have meaningful myths in education, I think they do come to us from these episodes, such as Tolstoy's school at Yasnaya Polyana, Dewey's 10 years or so at the University of Chicago Laboratory School, Madame Montessori's works. There are these, we could call these moments in space and time when excellence has been achieved, therefore it's possible.
So it seems to me that after I trained to be a theologian and a chaplain too, there's a new movement that we're embracing with people like Rabbi Dr. Moshe Dror from the formerly Ministry of Education in Israel, the idea of a chaplain to organizations, in particular schools. In fact, there was a chaplain to the school, King's College School, Wimbledon, where I was a student. We understand now a very specific purpose of the chaplain, and that's to illuminate the ideals of each person for themselves first, the organization second, and then all of them. And to look at the moments in which these ideals will be celebrated together is to do what Alfred North Whitehead called in one of his last books, the idea that worship is the high adventure of the human mind and is not merely a repetitious thing.
Well, I like the idea of chaplains in schools. I would say the secular counterpart that we have would be counselors in schools, but it doesn't achieve the same thing you're talking about.
I think that the chaplain is trained of necessity, and I want to use this phrase to strike a slightly jarring note relative to the mood I've struck so far. The chaplain is to throw caution to the winds intellectually and look for the highest good. And when you do that, you find that it's there waiting for you. And I don't mean that in a sacerdotal sense. I'm thinking of people like Heinrich Zwimmer and his book Philosophies of India, which begins with the subject, the highest good. Or on the West, Paul Tournier in his book, A Physician's Casebook in the Light of the Bible, that starts with the chapter, the highest good. What is the highest good? Only those who have not studied the gradient of excellence in what is good and what is better and what is best can deny that there is such a thing. But the discoveries of spiritual and depth psychologies has been that this highest good could also be called the lowest, that is the deepest. The deepest places of the heart, you know? And